Imagine a scream caught in your throat, echoing in the silence of an endless night as shadows dance across the cracked screen of a forgotten drive-in. In the dusty reaches of rural Oklahoma, where the wind whispers secrets through dry cornfields, and the sky seems to swallow all hope, something has awakened. It's not a nightmare that you can erase when you wake up. It's real, it's watching, and it knows exactly what scares you. Welcome, ladies, to a story that will crawl under your skin and stay there, whispering in the shadows of your mind for months. Get ready for the phantom clown of the abandoned Oklahoma drive-in, a plot that unfolds over the course of an entire year, full of mysteries that will make you question every creak in the floor of the house. It all begins on a warm summer night, when the protagonist, a 68-year-old woman who carries the strength of someone who has already defied emotional storms, decides to explore an abandoned drive-in she spots on State Highway 66. Her gray hair shines in the moonlight, her precise eyes hide an insatiable curiosity, and her stubborn determination pushes her beyond common sense. She heard stories from neighbors about lights flickering on the broken screen and muffled laughter coming from nowhere, but no one ever stayed to investigate. Alone since her husband left for a faraway place years ago, she searches for something, perhaps a purpose, perhaps a distraction from the emptiness that consumes her. Her internal conflict is clear, a struggle between the fear of losing herself again and the need to prove that she still has control over her life. As she steps onto the ground covered in appropriate herbs, she smells old oil and moldy popcorn wafting through the air. The rusty structure of the screen blows away in the wind, and then, for the first time, she sees him. A tall figure, dressed in the rags of a clown uniform, standing in the center of the deserted parking lot. The painted face is blurred, as if melting, and the eyes, infinite black holes, seem fixed on her. There is no sound, just a weight in your chest that makes you take a step back. When it blinks, it's gone. The car radio, which she left on, starts playing distorted children's music despite having been out of tune for years. In the following days, she tries to ignore what she saw, but the clown reappears in reflections, in the bathroom mirror, in the foggy kitchen window. Each time, he is closer, but he never speaks. The small town where she lives, with its corn pie markets and fervent Sunday services, begins to notice her restlessness. A neighbor, an old farmer obsessed with restoring broken machinery, insists that the drive-in has been cursed since the 1950s, when a traveling circus passed through there. He wants to prove his theory, but rejects the idea until he finds among his husband's old belongings a yellowed ticket from a clown show dating from that same decade. Weeks later, she returns to the drive-in, now with a flashlight and a Bible that she carries more out of superstition than faith. The clown is there again, but this time he holds a red balloon that floats against the wind. When she approaches, the balloon remains alone, releasing a sound that sounds like a muffled child's cry. Her heart races, and she realizes that the ground beneath her feet is covered in fresh footprints. Footprints that weren't there minutes ago. At home, she starts to hear light knocks on the walls at night, always in groups of 3, like a code that she can't decipher. Paranoia grows when she discovers, in a dusty file at the local library, that the drive-in was built on the land of a former farm worker camp, abandoned after an incident never explained in the records. A retired librarian, motivated by an obsession with local stories, warns that circus objects were buried there, but no one knows why. That night, she dreams of the clown holding a movie tape that projects images of herself as a child, laughing into a bucket that never happened. The months pass, and summer gives way to a cold autumn. The leaves are dry as bones beneath her feet as she fights the obsession to understand what the clown wants. She finds a rusty metal box at the drive-in, locked with a padlock, that she mysteriously opens with a key she found weeks earlier in the attic. Inside, screeching audio tapes reveal voices begging for freedom. The clown appears behind her as she listens, but now he points to the screen, where shadows dance without a light source. She realizes with a shudder that the shadows imitate her own movements. The tension rises when the farmer, trying to help her, brings an old projector to the drive-in, insisting that the answer lies in the images. The screen comes to life, showing a silent film of a clown, identical to the one chasing her, but he's not alone. There are offerings of them, all looking directly into the camera. She turns off the projector, but the image remains for seconds, longer. The librarian, now involved, suggests that the clown is a projection of something she carries inside, a fear that she never planned for. It shakes her, forcing her to question her sanity. In winter, the drive-in is covered in snow, but the lights on the screen flash red again. She returns, faces the biting cold and exhaustion, and finds a clown holding a mirror. In it, she sees not her reflection, but that of a younger woman crying. The collision revelation. The clown is not an external entity, but an echo of her own guilt over a secret she buried decades ago, a loss she has never overcome. Each step toward confronting him requires her to dredge up painful memories, and the cost is high: her peace, her loneliness, her view of herself. In the spring, the cornfield around the drive-in grows out of control, swallowing up the land. She decided to burn the ribbons and the box, but the clown reappears, now with a smile that wasn't there before. The fire didn't destroy him. He dissolves into the smoke, but she hears his laughter echoing as the drive-in collapses. Her success in ridding herself of the vision comes with a sacrifice, the certainty that he is still there, waiting, perhaps. Inside her, the story ends with her sitting at home, looking at the window, while the radio plays by itself, humming a melody that she follows but can't remember where. This is a plot that will delight you, ladies, with its sensory details, the smell of damp earth, the sound of muffled laughter, the chill that creeps through your bones, and its slow, real emotional connections. Oklahoma, with its culture of rural resilience and whispered superstitions, shapes every decision, every fear. You will feel the weight of isolation, the thrill of the unknown, and the question that remains: what would you do if the clown looked at you? The Oklahoma summer. Heat clung to my skin like a second layer, a wet weight that made even the crickets sing slower. Eleanor Hayes, or Ellie, as the few who knew her still called her, drove her old Buick down State Route 66, the asphalt rippling in the distance like a mirage. At 68 years old, she carried a rigid posture, the straight shoulders of someone who has thought more than she cares to remember, but her brown eyes sparkled with a curiosity that time could not erase. The radio, a faithful companion since her husband left for a faraway place 7 years earlier, squeaked softly, stuck between stations no one else heard. It was an ordinary night, or so she planned, until the car's headlight cut through the darkness and illuminated something she had never noticed before: the abandoned drive-in. The structure appeared like a skeleton from another era, the cracked screen rising against the starry sky, the rusty edges bent by the wind. Ellie slowed down, the engine growling in protest, and leaned her head out the window. The smell of dry corn from the surrounding fields mixed with something stranger, a faint scent of old oil and moldy popcorn, as if the past had been trapped there, fermenting. She had heard stories in town, whispered among the women in the church, about lights flashing on the screen at night, or laughter carried on the wind, but she had never paid attention. Superstition was the thing of those who had too much time, and Ellie preferred to spend hers repairing the broken teardrop in the attic or watering the withered petunias on the porch. But that night, something was suspended. Maybe it was the emptiness that had been growing inside her since she was alone, a hole that not even Sunday services or corn pies at the fair could fill. Or maybe it was just stubbornness, that spark that made her go through emotional storms without asking for help. She parked the Buick in the organic weed-covered driveway, the grass brushing against the chassis with a sound like a suggestion. The radio stayed on, playing static, while she took the flashlight from the glove compartment and went downstairs. His worn shoes dug into the dry earth, and the warm air enveloped his grey hair, which gleamed like silver in the moonlight. The drive-in was a graveyard of memories. Crooked posts, where other speakers hung, leaned like tired sentries. The ticket office, a small rotten wooden house, had a broken window that reflected the sky in shards. Ellie walked slowly, the flashlight gutting through the darkness in flickering beams. The screen creaked above her, a low groan that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She stopped in the center of the parking lot, the circle of light dancing over the cracked concrete, and then she saw him. A tall, motionless figure stood 20 meters away from her. Colorful rags hung from his body like a torn costume, red, and yellow stripes faded by time. The face was a blurred mask, the white paint running in grooves like tears, and the eyes, black holes too deep to be human, stared at her. He was a clown, but not like the fairs of old, with their juggling and balloons. There was something wrong, something sucking the air around him. Ellie felt a weight in her chest, as if someone had squeezed her lungs. She took a step back, heart pounding against her ribs, and blinked. When he opened his eyes, he was gone. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. She swung a flashlight around, but the parking lot was empty. The wind blew, carrying the rustling of corn leaves, and then the radio in the car came to life. A childish melody, distorted and scratchy, echoed through the night, Ring Around the Rosie, but too slow, as if played by a broken record. Ellie ran to the Buick, flashlight beam tremendous in her hands, and clicked off the radio. Silence fell again, but the sound still buzzed in his ears. The next morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was getting cold, too quickly she tried to rationalize. The heat, the loneliness, the imagination, everything conspired against her. But the reflection in the window glass made her freeze. For an instant, between the flowery curtains, she saw the clown again, closer, the black holes of his eyes staring at her. When he turned his head, there was nothing but the empty yard, the rusty swing swaying slightly in the breeze. Ellie slammed the cup open, her knuckles whitening. She wouldn't tell anyone, not yet. The following days were restless. The living. Room radio, she mentioned, turned on by itself one afternoon, chirping the same distorted tune before falling silent. Light knocks echoed off the walls at night, always in groups of 3. Like a code she didn't understand. She began to avoid mirrors, but the feeling of being watched grew, a tingling in the back of her neck that wouldn't leave her alone. In town, the old farmer next door, a man with calloused hands and suspicious eyes, noticed his distraction while he was fixing his tractor in the yard. He was obsessed with machines and old stories, and when Ellie casually showed up at the drive-in, he frowned. "I heard that place has been bad since the 1950s, he said, wiping the oil off his hands with a dirty cloth. A circus passed through. There, you know. After that, no one wanted the land anymore. He wanted to prove that the past explained everything, but Ellie shook her head, laughing. She didn't believe in curses. Yet that night, rummaging around in the attic for a distraction, she found a shoebox that she hadn't opened in years. Inside, among faded photos and yellowed letters, was a ticket. Circo dos Irmãos Maravilhas, 1953. The paper was stained, but the drawing of a laughing clown made her drop the box on the floor. The summer wore on, and Ellie felt the weight of what she had seen like a stone in her stomach. She returned to the drive-in on a moonless night, her mother's Bible tucked. Under her arm, out of superstition, the flashlight held tightly in her hand. The clown was there, in the same place, but now he was holding a red balloon floating against the wind. She took a step forward, her heart in her throat, and the balloon popped on its own. A sound escaped him, a muffled, childish cry that made his legs weak. The ground beneath her feet was covered in fresh footprints, boots too big to be hers, and she hadn't seen them when she arrived. Ellie walked home shaking, the smell of mouldy popcorn clinging to her nostrils. She locked the doors, but the knocking on the walls came out louder, more insistent. For the first time in years, she prayed, holding the Bible to her chest, but the silence that followed brought no rupture. Something was calling back to the drive-in, and she knew she couldn't ignore it much longer. Summer in Oklahoma dragged on like a fever that wouldn't break, the air thick with humidity and the incessant buzz of cicadas. Ellie Hayes woke up every morning with the same weight on her chest, a tightness that she couldn't explain. The house, with its worn wooden walls and faded flowered curtains, seemed smaller every day, as if the shadows were lengthening to fill it. She tried to occupy herself, watering the wilting petunias on the porch, mending a quilt she never finished, but her eyes kept returning to the window, to the road that led to the drive-in. The clown was there, she knew, waiting with those empty eyes that pierced her soul. Since the night of the balloon, Ellie hasn't been able to sleep well. The sound of muffled crying echoed in his mind, mixed with the knocks on the walls that came every night, always in triads, thump, thump, thump. She stopped telling herself it was the wind or the old pipes. The house was too quiet for that. The living room radio, which she swore she had turned off, would turn on by itself at random times, chirping a distorted children's tune before dying to static. Ellie began to leave the lights on, the yellow glow of the bulbs reflecting off the worn furniture, but even so, the corners of the house swallowed up the light. In the city, the slow pace continued. The women of the church gathered to plan the corn pie fair, the smell of sugar and butter wafting through the cobblestone streets. Ellie showed up one afternoon, hands stuffed in her cardigan pockets, trying to ground herself in normalcy. But the old farmer, whom she called Mr. Tom for lack of a better name, found her near the bandstand. He was committing a tractor stunt, his face scrunched up in concentration, the smell of grease mixing with sweat. When she left the footprints at the drive-in, his eyes narrowed. "I told you, Ellie, that place has history," he grumbled, wiping his hands on a grimy cloth. "The circus that passed through there in the 50s left something behind. My grandfather spoke of strange lights, of people who went and didn't come back straight in their heads. He was obsessed with unraveling the past, with recovering what was. Broken, machines or mysteries, it didn't matter." Ellie laughed, a dry sound that didn't convince even herself. "You and your stories, Tom. I'm going to end up thinking you believe in ghosts." But his words stayed with her, swirling around in her mind as she drove home. The entry I found in the attic was still on the kitchen table, the yellow paper staring at it like a challenge. She picked it up, her fingers shaking, and read it again. Circus of the Maravillas Brothers, 1953. There was no memory attached to it. She was too young at the time, and her husband never mentioned circuses. Still, the drawing of the clown in the corner, with his crooked smile, seemed alive, his eyes watching her as she turned the paper. That night, the knocking on the walls came earlier, accompanied by a new sound, a light scratching, like nails, against wood. Ellie sat on the couch, the Bible open on her lap, her fingers clutching the thin pages. The radio turned on by itself, the children's melody scratching the silence, and then she heard it. A whisper, too low to make out the words, but loud enough to make the back of her neck shiver. She slammed the radio down, the dial turning under, her shaking hand, and decided she needed answers. The next day, she went to the town library, a small building that smelled of musty paper and stale coffee. The retired librarian, a woman with white hair and glasses hanging from her neck, was rearranging books with almost obsessive precision. Ellie, an acquaintance by sight, they called her Mrs. Ruth, a curious soul who lived for local stories. When Ellie talked about the drive-in, Ruth's eyes lit up behind the lens. "You want to know the land, huh?" Ruth said, pulling a dusty file from a drawer. "There's not much in the official records. It was a farm worker camp before the drive-in in the 1940s. Abandoned after an incident. No one says what it was, just that the place was suddenly empty. She was driven by a need to preserve the past, to give voice to the stories that others have forgotten." Ellie flipped through the file, the pages cracking beneath her fingers, and found a black-and-white photo. The drive-in in the 60s, the new screen, cars lined up. But something caught his eye. In the corner of the image, almost out of focus, a tall, indistinct figure dressed in what are obviously striped rags. She took the file home, her heart beating too fast. "That night I dreamed about the clown. He was at the drive-in, holding a movie tape that was playing itself, projecting images onto the broken screen." Ellie saw the same thing, a child laughing. At a picnic, the golden sun beating down on her brown hair. But she never had a picnic like this. The memory wasn't hers. He woke up sweating. The room was dark and silent, but the sound of muffled laughter echoed in his ears. Summer came to an end when Ellie decided to return to the drive-in. The sky was heavy with storm clouds, the air smelling of rain and damp earth. She took a flashlight, the Bible, and, on impulse, the yellow ticket, stuffed in her coat pocket. The terrain felt different now. The grasses were taller, brushing against his legs like curious fingers. The screen creaked above her, the sound louder as the wind began to blow. And there he was, the clown, in the center of the parking lot, his rags flying like torn flags. This time he pointed at the screen. Ellie hesitated, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. Then, without explanation, the screen came to life. There was no projector, no electricity, but shadows dance across the cracked concrete, indistinct figures moving in circles. She took a step forward, her heart in her throat, and watched with a shudder as the shadows imitated her own movements. When I asked for a hand, they stood up too, like puppets attached to invisible strings. The clown tilted his head, his blurred face fixed on her, and the wind carried a sound that sounded like a low, almost human laugh. She ran back to her Buick, tires screeching against the gravel as she sped home. The radio turned on alone on the way, the children's melody clearer now, the words distorted but audible. "Round and round we go." Ellie turned it off with a slap, the silence that followed heavy like lead. At home, he locked the doors and sat in the kitchen, ticket in hand. The date, 1953, seemed to pulse on the paper. She didn't know what she did, but the dream, the shadows, the clown, it was all connected, and she felt like the past, not hers but someone's, was trying to reach her. The next few days were a blur. Mr. Tom showed up one afternoon carrying an old projector he found in the barn. "If there's something in that drive-in, Ellie, maybe it's in the pictures," he said, his eyes shining with a mix of curiosity and stubbornness. He wanted to prove his theory, and she, exhausted from fighting the unknown casually. Ruth, hearing about Ellie's visit to the library, also showed up, bringing a notebook about the camp incident. "It could be something you carry, Ellie," she suggested in a low voice. "Something you don't see." Autumn was slowly approaching, the leaves starting to turn golden on the oak trees around the house. Ellie felt the clown in every shadow, every reflection, but now she knew that running away was no longer an option. The drive-in was calling her, and she needed to go. Autumn came to Oklahoma in a whisper, the leaves on the oak trees around Ellie. Hayes's house turning amber and red, falling in wind-blown piles across the dirt streets. The air carried a subtle chill, the kind that crawled under your skin and settled into your bones. But Ellie barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, spinning. Around the drive-in, the clown, the shadows dancing on the broken screen. the house with its smell of old wood and reheated. Coffee felt like an increasingly fragile refuge. The knocking on the walls continued, now accompanied by scratches that made the boards creak, and the radio in the room insisted on turning on by itself, the childish melody echoing like a warning. Ellie spends her days trying to ground herself in a routine. She swept the porch, the sound of the broom against the wooden floor, a rhythm that kept her lucid, but her eyes always returned to State Highway 66, visible through the steamy kitchen window. The circus entrance, still on the table, felt like a weight she couldn't ignore. Mr. Tom appears every now and then, the sound of his tractor cutting through the afternoon silence as he tinkers with rusty parts in the yard next door. He was determined to take the projector to the drive-in, supplemented by the fact that the answers were in old images. "Let's go see that hidden place, Ellie," he said, wiping the oil off his hands with a dirty cloth, his eyes shining with a stubbornness she recognized in herself. A Mrs. Ruth will also become a constant presence. She would appear with her notebook, the pages full of scribbles about the farm worker camp and the incident that no one explained. "Sometimes the past doesn't leave us alone because we don't let it go," she said one afternoon while having tea in Ellie's living room. Ruth was driven by a need to make sense of the stories, to preserve what others had forgotten, and Ellie felt the weight of those words like a stone in her stomach. She didn't want to admit it, but the dream about the fake truck and the shadows on the screen were eating away at her, undermining her certainty that it was all just imagination. One morning, as the sky was covered in grey clouds, Ellie found something that changed the game. Rummaging through the attic for a distraction, she stumbled upon a rusty metal box hidden behind a pile of mouldy blankets. The padlock was locked, but on impulse she picked up a small key that she had found weeks before, lying between the floorboards. The key turned with a click, and the sound made his heart race. Inside the box were audio cassettes, the reels wrapped in brown paper, the musty smell rising like a mist. One of them had a handwritten label, recording 1953, Campo Oeste. Ellie walked down the stairs with shaking hands, the box weighing more than it should have. In the living room, she turned on the old recorder she acquired from her husband, the device hissing as she adjusted the tape. The sound that came was low, barely audible at first, static, the crackle of a distant fire, and then voices. There were fragments, pieces of muffled sentences. "We can't leave. He won't let us. Please, freedom." The voices were those of men and women, some tearful, others resigned, and the sound cut like a knife. Ellie turned. Off the recorder, the silence that followed so heavy she could barely breathe. That night, the clown appeared again. She was in the kitchen, the tape still on the table, when she looked out the window and saw him, not in the yard, but reflected, in the glass so close that he seemed to be behind her. The striped rags swayed as if blown by a wind that didn't exist, and the black eyes stared at her. She spun around, her heart in her throat, but the kitchen was empty. The radio turned on, alone, the children's melody louder now, the words "round" and "round" echoing like a mantra. Ellie rushed to turn it off, but the button turned falsely under her fingers, and the sound only stopped when she yanked the cord out of the socket. Autumn was advancing, and Ellie felt the siege closing. Mr. Tom showed up one rainy afternoon, his old projector loaded into the bed of his pickup truck. "Let's go today, Ellie," he insisted, his voice steady despite the water dripping from his hat. "If there's something at that drive-in, we need to see it." Ruth joined them, her notebook protected by a plastic bag, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and motivation. Ellie hesitated, but the weight of the ribbons, the ticket, the shadows, was too much. She grabbed a flashlight, a Bible, and, instinctively, one of the ribbons, stuffing it into her coat pocket. The drive-in looked different in the rain. The screen was slippery, the cracked concrete glistening with puddles that reflected the grey sky. The surrounding cornfield rustled. In the wind, the dry, rushes brushing against each other like a chorus of muffled voices. Tom set up the projector near the ticket booth, connecting it to a battery he had brought from the barn. "Let's see what he wants to show," he said, adjusting the lenses with his calloused hands. Ellie stood to the side, flashlight pointed at the screen, while Ruth held the notebook like a talisman. When the projector came to life, the light cut through the darkness, and the screen lit up. The film was muddy, grainy, showing a clown identical to the one chasing Ellie. He was in a ring, his striped rags flapping, but he wasn't alone. Other clowns' bags surrounded him, all with blurred faces, all looking directly at the camera. Ellie felt a chill creeping up her spine. Tom swore under his breath, and Ruth opened the notebook to her chest. Then the unthinkable happened. Ellie turned off the projector, but the image appeared on the screen for seconds too long, the clowns tilting their heads in unison before disappearing. The silence that followed was broken by a new sound. A low laugh, coming from the cornfield. The clown was there, just a few meters away from them, holding a red balloon that floated against the rain. Ellie stepped forward, a tremendous flashlight in her hand, and the balloon burst, releasing the same muffled cry as the ribbons. Tom grabbed her arm, pulling her back, while Ruth murmured something about echoes from the past. They ran to the pickup, the engine roaring as they sped away, the drive-in disappearing into the darkness behind them. At home, Ellie sat in the living room, tape in hand, recorder at her side. She turned it on again, the voices returning. "He trapped us. The screen sees everything." She saw with a shudder that the voices were not requested. They were a request, a plea that she did not understand. Ruth, still shaken, suggested that the clown could be more than a vision. "Maybe it's something you carry, Ellie," she said, her voice trembling. "Something you didn't plan." Tom, particularly, his eyes fixed on the projector that now rested in the corner of the room. "Or something that place won't let go." The following days were torment. The clown's laughter echoed in his dreams, mixed with the voices on the tapes. The radio turned on by itself more frequently, and knocks on the walls now came during the day, accompanied by scratches that left light marks on the wood. Ellie felt the weight of guilt, of a secret she couldn't name, growing inside her. Autumn was deepening. The leaves were falling like a carpet across the yard, and she knew the drive-in wouldn't leave her alone until she got back. Winter came to Oklahoma like a silent blanket, covering the cornfields with a thin layer of snow that crunched underfoot. The wind cut through the air, carrying flakes that danced before the fogged windows of Ellie Hayes's house, now a refuge that felt more like a prison. The cold seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls, bringing the smell of frozen earth and an emptiness that weighed heavily on her shoulders. Ellie, at age 68, felt each day like a battle against the unknown crawling around her. Grey hair fell into her eyes as she moved around the house, hands shaking, holding cups of tea that went cold before they could finish them. The tapping on the walls had evolved, no longer just triads, but an irregular rhythm, like fingers drumming impatiently. The depths in the wood left deeper marks, grooves that she found when she woke up, as if something was trying to get in. The radio in the living room, now a familiar enemy, came on at random times, the children's melody, "Round and Round We Go," echoing in tones that were beyond mockery. Ellie had stopped turning it off. Instead, he covered it with a thick cloth, muffling the sound, but the hiss still leaked out, crawling into his ears. Mr. Tom appeared less frequently. The cold made his yard work difficult, but he left the projector. In Ellie's living room, a silent presence that seemed to watch her. He became convinced that the drive-in held secrets visible only through the lens, and his last visit was marked by a warning. "Don't go alone again, Ellie. That's not natural." A Mrs. Ruth, on the other hand, had become a constant shadow, bringing books and notes that piled up on the kitchen table. She insisted that the camp incident was linked to the tapes, and her obsession with connecting the dots kept her glued to Ellie like an exposed ally. "It's an echo, Ellie," she said, her glasses reflecting the dim light from the lamp. "Something that got stuck." Ellie listened to the tapes over and over again, the voices recorded like ghosts whispering in her dreams. "He trapped us. The screen sees everything." She tried to decipher the meaning, but each session left her more lost, the weight of an unnamed secret pressing down on her chest. One afternoon, as the snow fell silently outside, she found a second tape in the metal box, unlabeled, but with a stronger, musty smell. As he put it into the recorder, he heard something new, a sound of muffled laughter, followed by a childish voice. "Have you seen it yet?" The recorder stopped on its own, the stop button clicking without her touching. That night the clown returned. Ellie was on the porch, the freezing air burning her lungs, when she looked out at the snow-covered yard and saw it reflected in the window glass. He was closer than ever, his striped rags covered in ice crystals, his black eyes fixed on her. But this time he was holding a small mirror, the kind that could fit in a pocket. She spun around, flashlight in hand, but the yard was empty, the snow untouched. The radio inside the house turned on, the melody cutting through the silence, and Ellie ran inside, locking the door with trembling fingers. The mirror stayed in his mind. The next morning, she returned to the attic, rummaging through boxes she hadn't opened in years. Among her husband's belongings, rusty tools, letters never sent, they found a hand mirror, its wooden handle chipped, the glass fogged with age. She held him, her heart racing, and saw not her reflection, but that of a younger woman, her eyes full of tears, her face contorted in silent crying. Ellie dropped the mirror, the sound of the glass cracking against the floor echoing through the house. The woman wasn't her, but something in the expression, the heaviness, the pain, felt familiar, like an echo of a memory she couldn't reach. Winter was advancing, and Ellie felt the clown's siege tightening. The lights of the drive-in, which she saw from the road on clear nights, blinked red, a pulse that cut through the darkness like a beacon. She knew she needed to return. But fear was security, an invisible chain that tied her to her home. Tom appeared one freezing morning, his face red from the cold, carrying a can of gasoline. "If it's an echo, like Ruth says, maybe we need something burned," he suggested in a firm voice. He wanted to end it, restore what was broken, and Ellie, exhausted from fighting alone, innocent. Ruth joined them, her notebook now full of scribbled theories. "The mirror, the tapes, the screen, it all points to you, Ellie," she said, eyes narrowed. "It's something you buried." Ellie felt a shiver, but didn't respond. They set off for the drive-in on a clear afternoon, the snow glistening in the weak sun. The terrain was unrecognizable, the surrounding cornfield covered in white, the cracked screen reflecting the sky like a broken mirror. The clown was there, in the center of the parking lot, mirror in hand, frozen rags fluttering like broken wings. Ellie stepped forward, flashlight steady, while Tom and Ruth stayed behind, the gas can in his hand, the notebook in hers. The clown tilted his head, and the mirror shone, showing the woman crying again. But this time, Ellie chose a sound, a low sob, coming from the mirror that mingled with the wind. She saw, with a shock that made her reel, that the woman was a younger version of herself carrying a guilt she had never faced. "What do you want?" she said, her voice hoarse against the cold. The clown did not respond, but was pointed to the screen, where shadows met the dance again, imitating her every movement. Tom poured gasoline on the base of the screen, the strong smell cutting through the air, but Ellie stopped him. Spring came to Oklahoma like a tentative sigh, the ice melting into streams that ran across the dry land. the cornfield around the drive-in growing out of control, the green rushes swallowing the abandoned land. Ellie Hayes felt the air changing, the smell of damp earth and new things mixing with the weight she had been carrying for months. The house, with its heat-marked walls and radio now silent beneath the thick cloth, looked like a battlefield she barely recognized. At 68, Ellie was exhausted, her brown eyes sunken into dark circles, but the stubbornness that defined her burned brighter than ever. The clown, the ribbons, the mirror, everything was pulling her back to the drive-in, and she knew the final showdown was near. Winter will leave scars. The red lights on the screen continued to flash on the clear nights, visible from the kitchen window, a call she could no longer ignore. The broken mirror was still in the attic, the crying woman's face etched in his mind like an open wound. Ellie spent weeks avoiding the drive-in, but the sound of voices from the tapes echoed in her dreams. He trapped us. The screen sees everything, mingled with the sobs she heard in the reflection. She felt guilt rising, a secret she couldn't name, but that weighed like a chain on her chest. Mr. Tom appeared more often now, his face weathered by the spring sun, his calloused hands carrying tools and the can of gasoline he insisted on keeping nearby. "We need to end this, Ellie," he said in a firm voice as he adjusted the projector in the room. He was driven by a need to restore what was broken, to put an end to what the drive-in stood for. A Mrs. Ruth, with her notebook now almost full, spending hours at Ellie's house, her glasses slipping down her nose as she took notes out loud. "The mirror is the key," she insisted, her eyes shining with an obsession that bordered on despair. "It's something you buried, Ellie, something the clown wants you to see." Ellie knew they were right, but the fear was safe. One afternoon, as the sun gilded the young leaves of the oak in the yard, she returned to the attic. Rummaging through the boxes, she found a yellowed photo she hadn't noticed before. A young woman, perhaps 20, smiling next to a man she knew as her younger husband, her eyes full of life. On the back, a note, 1953, before the circus. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She didn't remember that woman, but the weight in her chest grew, a repressed memory fighting to emerge. That night, the clown appeared again. Ellie was on the porch, in the open air, carrying the smell of fresh corn, when she looked up at the window and saw him, the striped rags fluttering, the mirror in his hand, the black eyes fixed on her. But this time, he smiled. A crooked smile that hadn't been there before. She ran inside, locking the door, but the radio turned on by itself, the children's melody clearer, the words round and round echoing like a promise. Ellie ripped the cloth off the radio and turned it off, the silence that followed, interrupted by a low laugh that seemed to come from every corner of the house. Spring was advancing, and Ellie felt time running out. Tom and Ruth convinced her to return to the drive-in one bright morning, the cornfield whispering around the grounds like a sea of green. She took a flashlight, a Bible, the tapes and the photo, stuffed in her coat pocket. Tom carried the gasoline and the projector, while Ruth held the notebook like a shield. The drive-in was different, the cracked screen covered in moss, the cracked concrete overrun with weeds, the air heavy with the smell of earth, and something else, something rotten that Ellie couldn't identify. The clown was there, in the center of the parking lot, the mirror reflecting the sun in blinding flashes. Ellie stepped forward, flashlight steady, while Tom prepared the gas and Ruth mumbled notes. "What do you want from me?" she said, her voice hoarse against the wind. The clown tilted his head, his smile widening, and pointed at the screen. Shadows danced again, but this time they were clear. Images of herself, younger, next to the woman in the photo, laughing at a picnic she now remembered. A memory came back like a punch. The woman was a friend from her youth, someone she lost in an accident she never faced, a guilt she had buried for decades. Ellie staggered, her legs giving out as Tom threw the gasoline at the base of the screen. "Let's burn this," he said, lighting a match, but Ellie the detective, her hand shaking. "No, I need to understand." She picked up the tapes and the projector, connecting them with her barely willing hands. The screen came to life, showing the clown and plays by others, but now the voices from the tapes echoed through the air. "Have you seen it yet?" Freedom. Ellie realizes with a shudder that the clown was not just an echo of the past, but a reflection of herself, a projection of the guilt she carried. The fire came by accident. Tom impatiently dropped the match, and the flames licked up the gasoline, rising across the screen in a wave of heat. The clown didn't move, but the smile disappeared as the fire engulfed him, the rags melting. Into the smoke. Ellie heard his laughter one last time, echoing as the drive-in collapsed, the screen falling into charred pieces. Tom and Ruth pulled back, the smell of burning filling the air, but Ellie watched, the weight in her chest easing for the first time in months. Back at the house, a spring blooms all around. The cornfield grew, but the drive-in was now a pile of ash. Ellie sat in the living room, the photo in her hand, tears falling as she remembered her lost friend, the accident she never faced. A summer day, a car out of control, a broken promise. The radio turned itself on one last time, the children's melody playing softly before going silent forever. Ellie knew the clown was gone, but the cost was high. The peace she gained came with the pain of facing what she would bury. The following days were calm. Tom fixed the tractor in the yard, Ruth wrote her notes, and Ellie planted new petunias on the porch, the sun warming her grey hair. The drive-in no longer called to her, but sometimes, on quiet nights, she would look out the window and hear a distant echo, not laughter but crying that she now understood. Spring in Oklahoma stood like a promise fulfilled, the sun warming the land that winter left scarred, the petunias on Ellie Hay's porch blooming in shades of purple and white that contrasted with the worn wood of the house. The cornfields surrounding. The land where the drive-in once stood grew tall, green swaying like a sea, swallowing the ashes of the past. Ellie, at 68, moved with a slowness that wasn't just of the body, it was of the soul, a weight relieved but not erased. Her grey hair fell over her shoulders as she swept the porch, the sound of the broom against the floor, a rhythm that anchored her to the present. The radio in the room remained silent now, the thick panorama still over him like a shroud. The knocking on the walls had stopped. The scratches on the wood were just scars that she sometimes traced with her fingers, reminders of a battle she had won at great cost. The drive-in fire weeks ago marked the end of the clown, or so she believed. The smell of gasoline and smoke still lingered in his memory, mixed with the sound of laughter that dissolved into the night. But the peace that came after was not complete. It was fragile, like a scab over a wound that still throbbed. Mr. Tom appeared almost daily, the roar of the tractor cutting through the silence as he worked in the yard next door. He looked relieved, his eyes less furrowed, his calloused hands now occupied with more mundane repairs. "That place won't bother us anymore," he said on his last visit, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a clean cloth. He wanted to believe that the fire had put an end to it all, but Ellie noticed the way he avoided looking at State Route 66. Mrs. Ruth, on the other hand, would become a more sparse presence, her notebook tucked away somewhere, replaced by a knitted one that she took out on Ellie's porch in the afternoons. "I wrote what I need," she had said, her glasses reflecting the sun. "The rest is up to you." Ruth was looking for closure, but Ellie felt her friend still watching her, waiting for something neither of them could name. Ellie spent her days trying to get used to the stillness. She planted seeds in the garden, the smell of fresh earth rising as she dug, but her eyes always returned to the photo on the kitchen table, the smiling young woman next to her husband, the back written 1953 before the circus. The memory of her lost friend, of the accident she had buried for decades, was now clear. A summer day, a runaway car on the road, a promise of care that Ellie had not kept. Guilt no longer haunted her like the clown, but lived silently within her, a companion she had learned to accept. One morning, while the dew was still glistening on the leaves of the cornfield, Ellie found something that made her stop. In the backyard, near the rusty swing, there was a small key, identical to the one that opened a box of tapes months before. She picked it up, the metal cool against her palm, and felt a shiver. There was no explanation. The attic was empty, the boxes gone through, the drive-in limited to ashes. But the key seemed alive, an echo of the past that refused to disappear. Ellie placed it in her cardigan pocket, her heart beating a little faster, and decided not to tell Tom or Ruth. Not yet. The following days were restless. The radio, which she swore was dead, made a low hiss one night, but there was no melody, just static that died on its own. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, but when she turned it was just the flowery curtains swaying in the breeze. Ellie began to hear a new sound, a whisper so low it could be the wind, but it seemed to form words. "Have you seen it?" She did the same thing, which was imagination, but the weight in her chest returned, suddenly, like a hand poking her. One afternoon, Tom showed up with something new. "I found this in the barn," he said, holding up an old film canister. The metal dented, but intact. "I had the projector stuff. Maybe there was something left." He wanted to understand the past, renew what was left, and Ellie, despite the knot in her stomach, decided to open up. Inside was a film tape, the roll dusty but preserved. They carried her into the living room. The projector came to life with a familiar hum. The makeshift screen, a white wall, lit up, showing grainy images of a buffet, people laughing, the golden sun hitting happy faces. Ellie watched the scene from her dream. But now she saw details. Her friend in the photo, young and alive, and herself laughing beside her. The film ended abruptly. The projector clicked into silence. That night, Ellie dreamed about a friend. She was at the drive-in, but there was no clown, just the young girl, her eyes full of tears, whispering, "Have you seen it?" Ellie woke up with her face wet, the room dark, the sound of the suggestion still in her ears. She took the key from her pocket and, on impulse, went back to the attic. Rummaging through the boxes, I found a small wooden chest that I hadn't noticed before, hidden under a pile of blankets. The key clicked into place, and inside were letters, items of them, handwritten, dated 1953. They were from her friend, asking for forgiveness for something Ellie didn't remember, talking about a plan that failed, about a day that will change everything. Spring was advancing, and Ellie felt the past intertwining with the present. She read the letters one by one, the paper fragile beneath her fingers, the smell of old ink rising like a ghost. The words told a story she repressed. A friend, pregnant, asking for help to escape a mistake, and Ellie, young and scared, promised support but backed away at the last moment. The road accident was the end, but the guilt began earlier. The clown she sees wasn't just the loss, it was the regret, the silence she imposed on herself. Tom and Ruth came on a warm afternoon, the cornfield rustling in the background. Ellie showed the cards, her voice steady despite her tears. "I let her go alone," she said, the weight of the words cutting through the air. Tom opened her shoulder. Ruth adjusted her glasses, and for the first time in months, Ellie felt a real connection between them, a bond forged in pain and search. They burned the letters in the backyard, the fire small but steady, the smell of burning paper rising as the sun set. The silence returned, but it was different now, lighter, truer. The radio was silent, the shadows stopped dancing, and the suggestion stopped. Ellie planted more petunias, the sun warming her grey hair, and sometimes she looked out into the cornfield, waiting for something that didn't come. The key sat on the kitchen table, a reminder of what to face, but the drive-in no longer called her. Spring was ending, and Ellie knew that the past would finally let her go. Or she would let it. Summer arrived in Oklahoma with relentless force, the scorching sun hitting the dry, golden cornfields that crackled in the hot wind. Ellie Hayes, age 68, felt the heat cling to her skin as she swept her porch, the petunias now wilting despite her efforts. The house, with its scarred walls and faded floral curtains, felt like a reclaimed refuge, but the silence she had fought so hard to find was beginning to feel fragile again. His grey hair gleamed in the bright light, and his still refined brown eyes scanned the horizon where the drive-in once stood, now just an empty lot swallowed by cornfields. The letters burned weeks ago left a void Ellie didn't expect. The fire in the backyard, the smell of old paper rising in spirals of smoke, brought temporary respite, but also a feeling of incompleteness. The small key found near the swing still rested on the kitchen table, the polished metal catching the sun in flashes that made her look away. She will not speak of her to Mr. Tom or Mrs. Ruth since the day of the fire. Tom was busy with the tractor, the roar of the machine echoing through the yard next door, and Ruth will return to her knitting, the notebook kept like a relic. But Ellie felt something changing, a tingling in the back of her neck that she couldn't explain. The radio, silent for weeks, made a low hiss one morning while Ellie was making coffee in the kitchen. It wasn't a children's melody, just static, but the sound made her freeze, the cup shaking in her hands. She covered the device with the thick cloth again, but the hissing returned at night, more insistent, accompanied by a whisper that seemed to come from the cornfield. "Have you seen it yet?" Ellie opened a window, the warm air carrying the smell of dry corn, but the land was empty, the rushes swaying like silent sentinels. Mr. Tom appeared one sultry afternoon, his face red from the heat, his calloused hands holding a hoe. "The cornfield looks weird," he said, pointing to the land where the drive-in will be located. "It grew too fast, Ellie. It's not natural." He was driven by a need to restore what he saw as wrong, and Ellie noticed the way he hurriedly avoided looking directly. She laughed, a dry sound that didn't convince her, but she decided to take a look. As they walked to the edge of the cornfield, the smell of hot earth rose, mixing with something sweet and rotten that made her stomach turn. In between rushes, Ellie found something that made her stop. A piece of red and yellow striped fabric tied to a stalk like a torn flag. Her heart sank. It was identical to the clown's rags, but the drive-in had been burned, the clown dissolved in smoke. She tore off the fabric, her fingers shaking, and put it in her pocket, deciding not to tell Tom. That night the voice came back, clearer. "Have you seen what was left?" Ellie stayed awake until dawn, the key in her hand, the weight on her chest growing like a shadow. Ruth appeared the next day, her knitting abandoned for a renewed sparkle in her eyes. "I heard the wind last night," she said in a low voice as they drank tea on the porch. "It sounded like voices, Ellie. A cornfield is talking." She wanted to understand, to preserve what was left of the mystery, and Ellie felt the weight of her friend's distrust. "You burned the letters," Ruth continued, adjusting her glasses, "but the past doesn't go away like that." Ellie hesitated, but held up the striped fabric, the rotten smell still clinging to the fibers. Ruth was silent, her fingers tracing the stripes as if reading a code. Summer progressed, and Ellie felt the siege closing in again. The radio chirped more frequently, the suggestion mixing with the static like a distant chorus. One afternoon, while watering the petunias, she saw something in the cornfield, a tall, indistinct figure moving among the rushes. He wasn't the clown, Not exactly. The rags were absent, but the black eyes stared at her for a moment before disappearing. Ellie dropped the watering can, the water enchanting the porch, and ran inside, locking the door with shaking hands. That night, she returned to the attic. The chest of letters was empty, but under a loose board, a small diary was found. The leather cracked, the pages yellowed. The key opened a short section, and inside were notes from her husband, dated 1953. "She doesn't understand what we did. The circus took more than it brought. The cornfield holds everything." Ellie read, her heart in her throat, realizing that her friend's accident wasn't just her fault. Her husband was involved, a shared secret he never revealed. The diary spoke of a ritual, something buried on the drive-in grounds, but the final words were blurred, illegible. The phrase came back, now loud enough to echo through the house. "Have you seen what's left?" Ellie felt a shiver, the diary falling from her hands. The next morning she called Tom and Ruth. He showed the diary, his voice firm despite his fear. "It's not over," she said, the striped fabric on the table next to the key. Tom cursed under his breath. Ruth adjusted her glasses, and the three decided to go to the cornfield. They took the flashlight, the Bible and the diary, the sun burning their backs as they crossed the high rushes. The lot where the drive-in stood was a sea of corn, but in the center Ellie found something new, a wooden box identical to the ribbons buried in the dirt. The key clicked open, revealing a roll of film and a note, "Burn it if you can." Tom prepared gasoline, but Ellie hesitated. The projector came back to mind. They set up the device right there, the film running in a slow pace. The makeshift screen showed the clown, but now he was in the cornfield, his black eyes fixed on the camera, his crooked smile returning as he pointed to something beyond the frame. The film stopped, and the whisper echoed around them, coming from the rush. "Have you seen what's left?" Ellie observes with a shock that makes her recoil that the cornfield wasn't just a field, it was an echo, a guardian of what the circus will leave behind. Tom poured gasoline on the box, the lit match in his hand, but Ellie stopped him. "No, I need to know." She put the film away, the weight of the decision crushing her, as inspiration laughed low, the sound lost in the wind. Back at home, summer runs its course. The radio crackled, the cornfield whispered, and Ellie felt the past creeping back. She knew that the clown, or what was left of him, was there, waiting, and that her peace was just a respite. The diary, the film, the key, everything called her to face what her husband hid, what the cornfield kept. The Oklahoma summer was deepening, the heat making the air thick and sticky, the cornfields around Ellie Hayes' house rustling with a sound that seemed alive. The sun burned off the golden rushes, the smell of dry earth and ripe corn rising, in waves that invaded the porch where Ellie spent her mornings. At 68, she felt the weight of the past months like an invisible chain, her grey hair sticking to her forehead as she swept the wooden floor. The petunias withered in the relentless heat, and the house, with its marked walls and faded curtains, seemed like a stage where the past refused to leave the scene. The radio in the room crackled intermittently, the static punctuated by suggestions that Ellie couldn't ignore. "Did you see what's left?" The thick cloth no longer muffled the sound, and she had stopped covering it, leaving the device exposed as a challenge. The striped fabric, her husband's diary, the film found in the cornfield. Everything listed on the kitchen table next to the key, a collection of fragments that pulled her towards something she didn't yet understand. The drive-in might be. In ashes, the clown scattered in smoke, but the cornfield held a secret that the fire won't touch. Mr. Tom showed up almost every day, the tractor purring in the yard next door as he fixed parts in the blazing sun. "That cornfield isn't right, Ellie," he said one afternoon, sweat dripping from his hat as he wiped his hands on a dirty cloth. It grows where it doesn't deviate too quickly. He wanted to solve the mystery, put an end to what was bothering him, and Ellie saw determination in his eyes, the same stubbornness that had kept her alive. Mrs. Ruth came less, but when she did, she had a refined look, her knitting replaced by a new notebook where she wrote down theories. "The diary talks about a ritual," she said, adjusting her glasses as she drank tea on the porch. "Your husband knew something, Ellie, something the circus left behind." Ruth was looking for answers, and Ellie felt the weight of her friends. Curiosity as a mirror of her own. Ellie spent her evenings with her diary, the pages yellowing in the dim light of the lamp, the smell of old leather mixing with the stifling heat of the room. Her husband's notes were fragmentary, but clear enough to give chills. The circus brought more than shows. "We buried it in the field, the cornfield guards." He mentioned a pact with someone from the circus, something he had promised to forget, but the final words blurred. By the humidity, left the rest in shadows. Ellie felt his guilt mixing with her friend's accident, the broken promise, and now this, a bigger secret that he took to a faraway place. One morning, as the sun rose red over the horizon, Ellie picked out a new sound in the cornfield. A rustling that wasn't the wind, a slow rhythm like footsteps between rushes. She grabbed the flashlight and left, the warm air enveloping her, the sweet, rotten smell coming back with a vengeance. Among the cornfield, he found another piece of striped fabric, larger this time, attached to a stalk like an offering. Her heart raced, but she put it in her pocket, her fingers trembling as she walked home. The radio chirped as it came in, the loudest whisper, "Have you seen what's left?" That afternoon, Tom and Ruth appeared together, the heat making them slow but sure. Ellie showed the fabric, the diary open on the table. "He hid something," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "No cornfields." Tom frowned, Ruth adjusted her glasses, and the three decided to watch the movie again. They set up the projector in the room. The white wall covered in screen, the hum of the device cutting through the silence. The film played grainy and shaky, showing the clown in the cornfield, his black eyes fixed on the camera, his crooked smile pointing to something beyond the frame. But this time Ellie saw more. Distinct figures among the rushes, shadows that weren't human, moving in circles as if in ritual. The film stopped, the projector clicked, and the whisper echoed through the room, coming from outside. "Have you seen what's left?" Ellie felt a shiver, the weight of the revelation crushing her. The cornfield wasn't just a field. It was a guardian, an echo of what the circus buried, something that her husband helped hide. Tom swore under his breath, Ruth scribbled in her notebook, and Ellie knew she would return to the field. They grabbed the flashlight, the Bible, the diary, and the film, the sun burning as they crossed the cornfield, hastily brushing against them like curious fingers. In the center of the land, where the box had been found, Ellie saw something new. A circle of bare earth, hastily pushed aside as if avoiding space. In the middle, a smooth stone, engraved with symbols she didn't recognize, pulsed with a heat that made no sense in summer. Tom touched it, recoiling with a muffled cry. "It's too hot." Ruth muttered something about ancient rituals, her eyes wide, while Ellie felt the suggestion coming from the stone. "Have you seen what's left?" She saw, with a shock that made her stagger, that the cornfield didn't just hold the past. It held something living, something her husband had sealed there. The summer wore on, and Ellie felt the siege tighten. The radio screeched every night, the melody blending into the static like a choir. Shadows danced among the cornfield, tall figures that disappeared when she looked directly. One afternoon, while watering the petunias, she saw the clown again, not in the cornfield, but reflected in the kitchen window, the striped rags fluttering, the black eyes fixed on her. He pointed to the ground, his crooked smile wider, and Ellie dropped the watering can, her heart in her throat. That night, she returned to the diary, finding a loose page she hadn't noticed before, hidden in the lining of the cover. It was a rudimentary hand-drawn map marking the center of the cornfield with an X. Next to it a note, "Don't dig it up. The circus took it but left it." Ellie felt the weight of her husband's betrayal, a shared guilt he never revealed. She called Tom and Ruth the next morning, map in hand. "We have to go," she said in a firm voice. Tom brought the hoe, Ruth the notebook, and the three of them braved the cornfield, the heat stifling as they dug in the circle of bare earth. The hoe hit something hard, a metal box, larger than the one with the tapes, sealed with a padlock. That the key opened with a click. Inside was a mirror, the glass fogged up, and a note, "Look if you dare." Ellie held the mirror, her heart racing, and saw not her reflection, but her husband, her eyes full of fear, her mouth moved in silence. "Have you seen what was left?" The voice echoed around her, the cornfield shaking as if breathing, and Ellie realized that the past wouldn't let her go so easily. Summer in Oklahoma reached its peak, the sweltering heat doubling the rushes of the cornfield around Ellie Hayes's house, the air thick with a sweet, rotten smell that clung to the nostrils. The sun burned the sky to a sickly orange, and Ellie, at 68, felt the weight of each day like a stone in her chest. Her grey hair lay on her forehead as she stood on the porch, her brown eyes fixed on the land where the drive-in once stood. Now a sea of corn that whispered secrets. Withered petunias hung in the pots, and the house, with its scratched walls and faded curtains, seemed to trap the heat like a trap. The mirror found in the cornfield was hidden on the kitchen table, the fogged glass reflecting the light in patterns that danced on the walls. The metal box, the note, "Look if you dare," and the map from her husband's diary formed a puzzle that Ellie couldn't ignore. The radio crackled every night, the whisper, "Did you see what's left?" echoing through the house like an invitation she was afraid to accept. The striped fabric, the film, the key, everything pointed to something her husband had sealed in the cornfield, something the circus had left behind that now called to her. Mr. Tom appeared one sultry morning, his face red from the heat, his calloused hands clutching the hoe he'd been given to dig up the box. "I don't like this, Ellie," he said, sweat dripping as he looked at the cornfield. "Whatever it is, it's alive in there." He wanted to fix what was wrong, put an end to the mystery, but Ellie saw the tremor in his hands, the doubt he was hiding. Mrs. Ruth arrived soon after, new notebook in hand, glasses sliding down her nose as she read the note aloud. "The mirror is a portal," she murmured, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and fascination. "Your husband knew, Ellie. He sealed something he couldn't control." Ruth sought to understand, and Ellie felt the weight of her friend's obsession as a reflection of her own. Ellie spent the night before with the diary, her husband's words burning in her mind. The circus took it, but it left him. The map, the ritual, the pact, everything suggested that the friend's accident was just the beginning, a piece in a bigger game that the husband is hiding. She felt his betrayal like a knife, a shared guilt he never confessed. The mirror called to her, the fogged glass pulsing with a subtle heat that she felt when she touched it, and the whisper of the cornfield grew louder, now audible even in the daytime. "Have you seen what's left?" One afternoon, as the sun blazed high in the sky, Ellie saw something new in the cornfield. Tall shadows, not one but many, moving among the rushes like a silent chorus. She grabbed a flashlight and went out. The heat enveloped her. The smell could be stronger as she crossed the field. In the center where the engraved stone was, I found a circle of bent fangs, as if trampled by something heavy. The mirror, which she left on the table, was there, resting on the stone, the glass clean now, reflecting not the cornfield, but a dark sky full of stars she didn't recognize. Ellie stepped back, her heart racing, and the whisper echoed around. Have you seen what's left?" That night she called Tom and Ruth. He showed the mirror, now back on the table, the diary open next to it. "He's here," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "No cornfields." Tom frowned. Ruth scribbled in her notebook, and the three decided to face their reflection. They took the mirror, the flashlight, the Bible, and the film to the center of the cornfield, the heat suffocating as the rushes brushed against them. The radio, left on the porch, screeched in the distance, the whisper mixing with the static like a chorus. In the circle of bare earth, Ellie held the mirror, the glass cool despite the heat. She looked, and her husband's reflection appeared. Again, his eyes full of fear, his mouth moving. "Have you seen what was left?" But this time, he wasn't alone. Distinct figures appeared behind him, tall and thin, their faces blurred like a clown's, their black eyes fixed on her. The hint came from the mirror, loud enough to make Tom drop his hoe. Ruth clutched the notebook. To her chest, Ellie saw, with a shiver that made her stagger, that the cornfield didn't just hold an echo, it held something her husband called, something the circus left alive. The summer wore on, and Ellie felt the siege tighten. The radio hissed non-stop, the whisper now a low chant that echoed through the house. Shadows danced in the cornfield, visible even in daylight, and the mirror, left on the table, reflected changing scenes, the husband, the figures, an empty arena under a strange sky. One morning, while watering the petunias, Ellie saw the clown in the window's reflection, his striped rags fluttering, his crooked smile pointing to the ground. She spun around, but the yard was empty, the cornfield whispering as if laughing. That afternoon, she returned to her diary, finding a torn page that fit the last entry. "The mirror shows. Don't let them out." Ellie felt the weight of her husband's betrayal, the ritual he had sealed in the cornfield, and called Tom and Ruth again. "We have to burn the mirror," she said in a firm voice. Tom brought the gasoline, Ruth the notebook, and the three of them faced the cornfield once more, the sun burning down as they dug around the stone. The mirror was placed in the circle, the gasoline poured. But when Tom lit the match, the reflection changed. The husband spoke without a sound, the figures behind him advancing, the black eyes pulsing. The fire licked the mirror, the glass cracked with a sound that echoed through the cornfield, but the suggestion didn't stop. It became a low laugh coming from the rush. Ellie saw, with a shock that made her recoil, that the cornfield was shaking, bending hastily, as if something was moving beneath the earth. Tom poured more gasoline. Ruth muttered something about broken seals, and the fire grew, the burning smell, mixing with the rot. The mirror melted, the reflection disappeared, but the laughter found it low and insistent. Back at home, summer runs its course. The radio went silent, but the cornfield whispered, the sound now a constant murmur. Ellie felt the weight of victory. The mirror was destroyed, the reflection sealed, but the cost was clear. The cornfield would not leave her alone. She knew that her husband called something that the fire could not put out, something that he waited for, laughing in between hurries. Summer in Oklahoma began to relent, the relentless heat giving way to cooler nights, the cornfield around Ellie Hayes's house swaying with a suggestion that never quieted. The sun still burned during the day, reaching a dry, golden rush, but the air carried a touch of autumn. The smell of earth mixing with sweet could make Ellie learn to consider. At 68, she has felt the weight of a year's worth of battles, her grey hair falling into her eyes as she sweeps the porch, the petunias now dwindling to withered stems. The house, with its scratched walls and faded curtains, felt like a situated refuge, the silence inside contrasting with the constant murmur of the cornfield. The mirror was destroyed. The glass fell into charred pieces that Tom had buried in the yard, but the low laughter that would echo in the fire did not disappear. It became part of the cornfield, a sound that came from the prey like a muffled chorus. The radio in the room remained bare, the thick cloth played in a corner, but Ellie heard the whisper in her dreams. "Have you seen what's left?" The husband's diary, the striped fabric, the film, everything pointed to a ritual that he had sealed in the land, something that the circus would leave behind and that the fire would not be able to put out. She felt his betrayal like an open wound, the shared guilt he never confessed now a burden she carried alone. Mr. Tom appeared less frequently, the tractor silent in the yard next door as he recovered from the heat and strain. "That cornfield is alive, Ellie," he said on his last visit, his eyes furrowed as he wiped his hands on a dirty cloth. "I don't know what else to do." He wanted to make up for what was wrong, but the combustion had caught up with him, and Ellie could see the weight on his shoulders. Mrs. Ruth, on the other hand, had become a constant presence again, her new notebook filled with scribbles about rituals and seals. "Fire cuts something," she said one afternoon, her glasses reflecting the sun as they drank tea on the porch. "But it's not over, Ellie. The cornfield is holding." Ruth was searching for answers, and Ellie felt her friend's determination like an echo of her own. Ellie spent days revisiting the diary. Her husband's words burned into her mind. "The mirror shows. Don't let them out." The map, the stone, the ritual. Everything suggested that the cornfield was more than a field. It was a guardian of something her husband had called and sealed. One morning, as the sky turned grey with storm clouds, she found a loose note folded between the pages. "The heart beats. Burn the center." Her heart raced, and Ellie knew she needed to go back to the cornfield, face what was left. The whisper grew, now audible even in daylight, a murmur that seemed to form words. "Have you seen what's left?" One afternoon, while watering the yard, Ellie saw shadows among the rushes, tall, thin, moving in circles like in the movie. She grabbed a flashlight and headed out, the warm air enveloping her, the rotten smell stronger as she crossed the field. In the center, where the engraved stone was, the circle of bare earth pulsed with a subtle heat, hastily folded around it as if worshipping something. Ellie touched the stone, recoiling with a shiver. It was warm, alive, and the whisper came. From her, "Have you seen what's left?" That night she called Tom and Ruth. He showed the note, his voice firm despite his fear. "The center," she said, pointing to the map. "We have to burn it." Tom brought the gasoline, his eyes tired but certain, while Ruth held the notebook like a talisman. They took the flashlight, Bible, and journal out into the cornfield, the sky darkening with the approaching storm. They hurriedly brushed against them, the sound like a chorus of muffled voices, and the putrid smell filled the air as it reached the circle. Ellie stood before the stone, the heat pulsing beneath her feet, the whisper now a low chant that echoed across the field. Tom poured the gasoline around, the liquid glistening against the earth, while Ruth muttered something about old stamps. "The heart beats," Ellie repeated, her husband's words in her mind, and lit the match with trembling hands. The fire came to life, the flames licking the stone, the smell of burning mixing with the power. The cornfield shook, the rushes bending as if screaming, and the low laughter returned, loud enough to make Tom flinch. Ruth smashed the notebook against her chest. Ellie saw, with a shock that made her stagger, shadows emerging from the fire. Not the clown, but indistinct figures, tall and thin, their black eyes pulsing as the cornfield burned around them. The transcript became a muffled cry. "Have you seen what's left?" She saw, her heart in her throat, that her husband had not sealed something to protect. He had sealed it to bind, and the fire was releasing. Tom poured more gasoline. Ruth mentioned to stop, but Ellie stood her ground, the heat burning her hands as the flames grew. Fire consumed the circle, the stone cracked with a sound that echoed across the field, and the shadows disappeared, dissolved into smoke. The cornfield stopped shaking, the whispering falling silent, but the laughter found low and distant, coming from somewhere beyond the ground. Ellie fell to her knees, the smell of burning earth filling her lungs, the weight in her chest easing, but not going away. Tom helped her up, Ruth muttered something about broken cycles, and the three of them headed home, the sky exploding with thunder as the rain began to fall. Summer was over, and Ellie felt victory like an open wound. The burned cornfield was now a field of ash, hastily reduced to charred stumps, but distant laughter echoed in his ears on the still nights. The radio went silent. The diary was kept in a drawer, and the key remained on the table, a reminder of what to face. Tom fixed the tractor again, Ruth wrote in her notebook, and Ellie planted new seeds in the yard, the sun warming her grey hair. But sometimes in the rain, she would look out into the cornfield and hear the whisper, so low it could have been the wind. "Have you seen what's left?" Ellie knew her husband called something a liberating fire, something that waited beyond the field, laughing in the darkness. The peace she will achieve will come at a cost. The certainty that the cornfield, or what was left of it, would never leave her completely. Autumn came to Oklahoma like a silent transition, rain falling in thin veils that enchanted the land where the cornfield had once risen, now a field of ash and burned stumps. Ellie Hayes, age 68, felt the damp chill creep across her joints as she swept her porch, the sound of the broom against the wood, muffled by the steady patter of water. Her grey hair glistened with droplets, and her brown eyes scanned the horizon, the empty land, looking like a tomb she had dug herself. The young petunias in the yard withstood the rain, but at home, with its scarred walls and faded curtains, they seemed to soak up the moisture like a sponge, the smell of wet wood filling the air. The fire in the cornfield weeks ago brought a silence that Ellie hoped would be permanent. The radio in the room no longer hissed. The thick cloth played in a corner like a forgotten relic. Her husband's diary was kept in a drawer under lock and key on the kitchen table, reflecting the grey light from the window. But the low laughter, the one that escaped the flames, still echoed in his ears on quiet nights, a whisper that the rain seemed to carry. "Have you seen what was left?" Ellie knew that her husband would seal something in the cornfield, something that the circus would leave and that the fire would release. But she wanted to believe that the destruction of the field put an end to the nightmare. Mr. Tom would appear. Sporadically, the tractor silent in the yard next door as he recovered from the summer's exertion. "The cornfield is dead, Ellie," he said on his last visit, his face wrinkled and relaxed from the rain. "We put an end to it." He wanted to close the chapter, regain what was left of normalcy, but Ellie noticed the way he avoided looking at the empty lot. Mrs. Ruth, on the other hand, had become a constant shadow, her new notebook always at hand, her glasses fogged up as she took notes on the porch. "The fire released something," she said one afternoon, her voice low against the sound of rain. "It didn't stay in the cornfield, Ellie. It's loose now." Ruth sought to understand, and Ellie felt the weight of her friend's concern as a reflection of her own. Ellie spends her days trying to ground herself in a routine. She fixed the tear in the attic, the wood guard a familiar sound that kept her lucid, but her eyes always returned to the window, to the enchanted field. One morning, as the rain drummed on the roof, she heard something new. A whisper, not from the cornfield, but from the street beyond the yard, low and indistinct. "Have you seen what's left?" Ellie opened the door, the cold air cutting into her lungs, and saw the empty lot, the rain falling in sheets, but the sound seemed to be coming from further away, from the sleepy little town along State Route 66. That afternoon, Tom arrived with news. "I found this in the truck," he said, holding up a piece of striped fabric, wet and faded, with almost indistinct red and yellow colors. "I was on the bench, Ellie. I don't know how." He wanted an explanation, and Ellie felt her heart race. As she reached for the fabric, the smell might return subtly under the humidity. She slipped it into her cardigan pocket, deciding not to tell Ruth yet. The radio, which she swore was dead, was emitting a low hiss in the night. The static mixed with the whisper that now seemed closer. "Have you seen what's left?" Autumn advanced, and Ellie felt the siege open. The message was no longer stuck in the cornfield, moving, crawling through the rain, echoing in the city's cobblestone streets. One afternoon, while buying groceries at the corner store, she saw something in the reflection of the window. A tall, indistinct figure, striped rags fluttering in the rain, black eyes fixed on her. Ellie spun around, the shopping bag shaking in her hands, but the street was empty, the rain falling in puddles that reflected the grey sky. The salesman, a middle-aged man with a tired smile, noticed her uneasiness. "Do you hear things in the rain, ma'am?" he asked, his voice full of rural superstition. "They say the wind carries voices around here." That night Ellie returned to the attic. Rummaging through the boxes, I found a crumpled letter that I hadn't noticed before, hidden beneath the tear. It was from her husband, dated 1953, with the trembling words, "The circus took it but left them. The seal won't hold forever. If they let go, it won't stay in the field." Ellie felt the weight of his betrayal. The ritual he had sealed in the cornfield now spread through the rain, and the suggestion echoed through the house, coming from the window. "Have you seen what's left?" She saw, with a shudder, that the fire didn't end anything. It just scattered what the cornfield contained. The radio chirped again, the clearest suggestion, and Ellie called Tom and Ruth the next morning. He showed the letter, the striped fabric on the table. "It's raining," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "What he sealed is loose." Tom swore under his breath, Ruth scribbled in her notebook, and the three decided to investigate. They took the flashlight, the Bible and the diary into the city, the rain enchanting their clothes as they walked through. The deserted streets, the whisper echoed in the alleys, in the fogged windows, a low chorus that seemed to follow their every step. In an empty lot near the church, Ellie saw something new. A smooth stone, identical to the cornfield, engraved with symbols that pulsed. In the rain, the whisper came from her, loud enough to make Tom flinch. Ruth clutched the notebook to her chest. Ellie touched the stone, the subtle heat against her fingers, and heard, "Have you seen what's left?" She saw, her heart in her throat, that her husband's ritual was not unique. There were other seals spread throughout the city, and the fire in the cornfield broke the first, freeing what they kept. The rain fell harder, and Ellie felt the weight of the fight that wasn't over. The radio hissed in the house, the whisper now a chant that echoed through the streets. Shadows danced in the rain, tall figures that disappeared when she looked directly. Tom suggested burning the stone, but Ellie hesitated, diary in hand. "We have to understand," she said in a firm voice. Ruth received it, her eyes shining, with the promise of answers, and the three returned home, low laughter following them through the rain. Autumn took its course, and Ellie knew that the peace she had achieved was an illusion. The cornfield was just the beginning. What her husband had saddled was loose, crawling through the rain, waiting in the shadows of the city. She planted messages in the yard, the cold biting her grey hair, but the whisper remained, an echo that promised more. Autumn in Oklahoma was deepening, rain falling in steady sheets that turned the small town's cobblestone streets into slippery mirrors. Ellie Hayes, aged 68, felt the damp chill seep through her boots as she walked across the porch, the sound of her broom muffled by the patter of water. His grey hair dripped, his brown eyes fixed on the empty land where the cornfield burned, now an enchanted field that reflected the grey sky. The house, with its scarred walls and faded curtains, seemed to shrink under the weight of the rain, the smell of damp wood mixing with a whisper that never stopped. Have you seen what's left? The radio in the room will crackle again. The static, punctuated by a low chorus that echoes off the walls, even with the thick cloth played in one corner. The husband's diary, the letter, the striped fabric, everything pointed to a ritual that he had sealed in multiple points, something that the circus had left and that the fire in the cornfield will release. Ellie felt his betrayal like a lump in her throat, the shared guilt that he never confessed now a burden that spread across the city. The stone in the church, pulsing with heat and suggestions, was just the beginning. There were other seals, and she knew I found them. Mr. Tom appeared daily, his wrinkled face wet from the rain, his calloused hands holding the tools he carried, out of habit. "It's everywhere, Ellie," he said that morning, his hat dripping as he looked at the streets. "I heard it in the rain yesterday. It's not just the cornfield anymore." He wanted to retrieve what was loose, but exhaustion made him hesitant, and Ellie saw the fear in his eyes. Mrs. Ruth, on the other hand, had become a tireless force, her new notebook soaked but firm in her hands. "They're stamps," she said on the porch, her glasses fogged up as she took notes. "Your husband made more than one, Ellie. The cornfield was just the first." Ruth searched for answers, and Ellie felt her friend's determination mirror her own. Ellie spent the nights with the diary, her husband's words burning in her mind. If they get loose, they won't stay in the field. The letter spoke of a pact. The map marked the cornfield, but the stone in the church suggested other points. One afternoon, as the rain drummed on the roof, she heard the changing whisper, no longer just, "Have you seen what's left?" but a low, almost melodic chant coming from the streets, "We see you." Ellie opened the door, the cold air cutting into her lungs, and saw tall shadows dancing in the rain, indistinct figures that disappeared. When she blinked, that night Tom and Ruth appeared together, the wind howling as they entered the house. Ellie showed the diary, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It's the stones," she said, pointing to the note about the beating heart. "There are more of them." Tom frowned. Ruth scribbled in her notebook, and the three decided to hunt for the stamps. They took the flashlight, the Bible and the diary, the rain enchanting their clothes as they searched the city. The whisper echoed in the alleys, in the fogged windows, a chorus that seemed to guide them. In an empty lot near the library, Ellie found the second stone, smooth and engraved, pulsing with heat in the rain. The whisper came from her, loud and clear, "We see you." Tom touched her, recoiling with a muffled curse, while Ruth muttered something about scattered rituals. Ellie felt the weight of her husband's betrayal. He had sealed something in every corner of the city, and the fire in the cornfield had broken the balance. The radio screeched in the house, the singing mixing with the static, and the shadows danced in the rain, clearer now, black eyes fixed on her. Autumn advanced, and Ellie felt the siege tighten. The message had become a constant chant, echoing through the streets, in the whispered conversations at the Pie Fair, in the Sunday services she avoided. One morning, while buying bread, the store clerk presented Voices in the Rain, his eyes full of rural superstition. Ellie saw the clown in the window's reflection, his striped rags fluttering, his crooked smile pointing to the ground, and she spun around, but the street was empty, the rain falling in shadow-reflecting puddles. That afternoon she returned to the attic. Rummaging through the boxes, I found a crumpled drawing hidden in a drawer, a sketch of her husband, showing 4 stones in a circle, each marked with a symbol. On the back, a note, "Burn them all, or they will leave." Ellie felt her heart race, the weight of his betrayal crushing her. She called Tom and Ruth with the drawing in hand. "There are 4, she said, her voice firm. 2 found, 2 to go." Tom brought the gas, Ruth the notebook, and the 3 of them braved the rain and biting cold as they searched. The 3rd stone was in the cemetery, near a crooked oak, pulsing, with heat and singing. "We see you." Ellie touched her, the suggestion echoing in her bones, and Tom poured the gasoline, the lit match in his hand. The fire licked the stone, the heat burning his hands, and shadows dance in the rain, tall figures that have dissolved into the smoke. The singing stopped for a moment, but returned, lower, coming from somewhere else. The fourth stone was in. The square, hidden under the bandstand, the engraved symbol almost erased. Ellie hesitated, the weight of the decision crushing her, but she lit the match, the fire consuming the stone as the low laughter echoed in the rain. The radio screeched at home, the singing went silent, and Ellie felt the victory like an emptiness. The stones were burned, the seals destroyed, but the laughter was permanent, distant and insistent, coming from the rain that didn't stop. Tom and Ruth returned with her, the silence between them heavy, and Ellie planted seeds in the yard, the cold biting her grey hair. Autumn was ending, and she knew her husband was calling something the fire couldn't put out, something he waited for, laughing in the darkness beyond the city. On quiet nights, Ellie heard the whisper in the rain, so low it might have been the wind. "We see you." She locked the door. The weight of the peace achieved mixed with the certainty that what had been freed was still watching her, patiently, in the wet shadows. Winter arrived in Oklahoma with an icy whisper, the autumn rain giving way to biting winds that carried scattered snowflakes over the small town. Ellie Hayes, aged 68, felt the cold biting her fingers as she swept the porch, the sound of the broom against the wood, a rhythm that kept her grounded. His grey hair shone with frost, his brown eyes fixed on the empty ground where the cornfield burned, now a grey expanse, covered in a thin layer of snow. The house, with its scarred walls and faded curtains, creaked in the wind, the smell of damp wood mixing with a whisper the rain left behind. "We see you." The stones were destroyed, the seals burned weeks ago, but the low laughter that will echo in the smoke has not disappeared. It has become part of the city, a sound that the wind carries through the streets, in the fogged windows, in the silent alleys. The radio in the living room remained silent, the thick cloth forgotten in the corner, but Ellie heard the singing in her dreams, a muffled chorus that seemed closer each night. Her husband's diary, kept in the drawer, the letter, the striped fabric, everything pointed to a ritual that he had sealed and that the fire would release, something that the circus left behind and that now lived freely, intertwined in the life she knew. Mr. Tom appeared less frequently, his tractor covered by a tarp in the yard next door as he took shelter from the cold. "It's too quiet, Ellie," he said on the last visit, his face red from the wind as he wiped his hands on an old cloth. "But I hear it sometimes without wind." He wanted to believe that the worst would happen, but Ellie saw the restlessness in his eyes, the same one that kept her awake. Mrs. Ruth, on the other hand, had become a constant presence, her new notebook now a thick tome of notes. "It's not over," she said one morning, her glasses fogged up as they drank tea on the covered porch. "What he sealed is here, Ellie. You see us." Ruth sought to understand, and Ellie felt her friend's obsession as an echo of her own. Ellie spent her days trying to adapt. She repaired the tear in the attic, the wood guard a sound that calmed her, but her eyes always returned to the window, to the snow-covered streets. One afternoon, as the wind howled, she heard the chant changing, no longer just, "We see you," but a softer, almost gentle murmur. "Do you see us?" Ellie opened the door, the frigid air cutting into her lungs, and saw the empty lot, the snow falling silently, but the sound seemed to be coming from within the town, from the sleeping houses along State Route 66. That night Tom came up with a discovery. "I found this in the barn," he said, holding up a piece of film tape, the roll dusty but intact. "I had the projector stuff." He wanted answers, and Ellie felt her heart race as she reached for the tape, the musty smell rising in the cold. She put it in a drawer, deciding not to tell Ruth yet. The radio, which she swore was dead, was emitting a low hiss in the night, the static mixed with the singing that now seemed closer. "Do you see us?" Winter was advancing, and Ellie felt the weight shifting. The singing was no longer a threat. It was a presence, creeping on the wind, echoing in the whispered conversations of the corner store. In the Sunday services she began attending again. One morning, while buying coffee, the aggressive salesman shadows in the snow, his eyes full of rural superstition. Ellie saw a figure in the window's reflection, tall and indistinct, striped rags blowing in the wind, black eyes fixed on her. She turned, but the street was empty. The snow fell in flakes that reflected shadows. That afternoon she returned to the attic. Rummaging through the boxes, she found a crumpled photo hidden under the ceiling. Her husband, young, next to men in circus uniforms, all smiling under a clear sky. On the back a note, "They stay, don't fight." Ellie felt the weight of his betrayal, the ritual he had sealed away now a living shadow, and the chant echoed through the house from the window. "Do you see us?" She saw with a shudder that the fire would not release something to destroy her. It would release something that wanted to be seen, that lived among them. The radio chirped again, the singing clearer, and Ellie called Tom and Ruth the next morning. He showed the photo, the tape in his hand. "It's here," she said, her voice firm despite the cold in her chest. "It won't go away." Tom frowned. Ruth scribbled in her notebook, and the three decided to watch the tape. They set up the projector in the room, the white wall covered in screen, the hum of the device cutting through the silence. The film rolled, showing the circus, the clown, the tall figures dancing in a ring, but now they looked at the camera, their black eyes pulsing. Their chant echoing, "Do you see us?" The movie stopped, and singing came from outside, low and gentle, from the falling snow. Ellie felt a different weight, not one of fear, but of accessibility. The husband called something that the circus left, something that the fire spread, and now lived with them, a shadow that was not necessarily burned. Tom suggested destroying the tape, but Ellie shook her head. "No, they want to be seen." Ruth sat casually, her eyes shining with understanding, and the three of them silent, their singing mingling with the wind. Winter took its course, and Ellie adapted to its presence. The radio chirped sporadically, the singing a constant murmur that echoed throughout the city. Shadows danced on the snow, visible in the windows of the houses, in the reflections of the puddles, but no one spoke of them. They were part of the place now, an echo carried by the wind. Ellie plants seeds in the yard, the cold cutting through her grey hair, and sometimes she looks out onto the street, seeing the tall figures among the flakes, their black eyes fixed on her. On quiet nights, she would hear singing in the snow, so low it might have been the wind. "Do you see us?" Ellie locked the door, the weight of peace mixed with the certainty that what her husband had sealed would not leave her. Not as a threat, but as company, crawling in the cold shadows of the city. You have just walked through the shadows of... The cornfield felt the freezing rain and heard the laughter that was never silenced. Ellie Hayes defeated the past, burned the seals, and found a peace that dances on the line of the unknown. But is this story really over? What do you think still lurks in the snow-covered streets of Oklahoma? Leave your theories in the comments below, because I know that you, with all the wisdom and courage you carry, have something to say. Let's keep this mystery alive together. Write now and tell me, have you seen what's left? And if that tale left a shiver down your spine, if the sound of the wind outside your window now seems a little different, then don't miss the next one. Click the subscribe button below. It's just a tap, but make sure you don't feel deprived the next time the shadows start dancing. Hit the bell too, because I promise there are more stories coming, more secrets to unearth, and I want you with me on every step of this journey. Sign up now, ladies, because the unknown doesn't wait, and I know you won't want to miss out.